What's up, legends, and welcome back to another Unmatched the Witcher first impressions video. Today we are going to be talking about the accursed woman on my phone, Ciri. We are going to play a little bit of a game. Oh, there she is. I want you to hydrate, homies, every time your Apple woman activates while listening to this video. Just me saying it that one time. Shut up. Just me saying it that one time made her awaken. So I'm going to take a little swig of water. And if you have an iPhone, I want you to also take some water every time your phone wakes up during this video. And if you don't have an iPhone, you can just take a sip of water with me because this is going to get a little ridiculous. So, this is a first impressions video. I want to say thank you to everyone for holding on to their unicorns as well as horses while I was away at PAX Unplugged over the weekend. It was so nice seeing so many fans of Unmatched, teaching people how to play Unmatched, running tournaments, and seeing all of the familiar faces that I've met throughout the years doing these sort of events with Restoration. It is one of my favorite parts about being in this community, and it was amazing to see all of you wonderful, lovely people. If you are one of the few people that has not ordered The Witcher yet, there is a link in the top of my description that will take you to the Restoration Games website where you can order the Witcher sets right now. And thank you to Restoration for sending me an early preview copy of these sets so I can make these videos for you guys. And with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Ciri. One thing that I think Ciri nails as a unique mechanic for her is the sense of progression. Now, I think the most common comparison that this character will get will be to Sinbad, although I think that doesn't quite do this character justice. Sinbad progresses when he attacks. His progression is very red. It's all about voyages and building up his attack values, and then eventually getting them all back, repeating the cycle, being able to move around the board like a madman. Ciri works very differently. Ciri has versatile cards and a scheme that also progress with some of her red cards. So she is very diverse and very versatile with her progression effects. And I think while the idea of play card, count cards, and discard pile, big number equals better, is similar, I think that is where the comparison stops. Ciri is very interesting. Oh, there she is. Let's hydrate, homies. She is very interesting in the way she progresses, and it is different than anything we've seen so far in Unmatched, and I'm excited for what this character can do, even if I have a few questions about how viable it will actually be. Taking a look at her ability card, she is double melee with the Sidekick that, oh boy, I know I typically pronounce things wrong. I want to say Haraquax, but I was telling people at PAX, I just say Illinois, just so I can pronounce that right. But Uncontainable Power is her ability, and it says when she has 7 source cards in her discard pile, effects on Ciri's cards cannot be canceled. This is something similar to Winter Soldier and Sherlock Holmes of not having effects be able to be canceled. And I think this is probably the worst incarnation of this ability, and I will explain why in a little bit. Obviously, the Winter Soldier is a little bit different because he has some bad effects, but he also has some good effects that you don't want canceled. So it's a toss-up there. Is it the worst by a large margin? Definitely not, but I don't think it's as good as it seems. Looking at the source cards, there are 5 different source cards. The Lion Cub of Sintra being the only attack only, and Child of the Elder Blood being a scheme, the other 3 being versatiles. There are 13 of these cards, so if we're taking a look at the ability, that kicks in at 7. which means if there are 13, that means there are 6 of these cards that you will get to play without them being canceled. Of course, the other effects in this deck won't be able to be canceled either. But remember, it is series cards only, so your Sidekick cards can still be canceled as normal. And some of the source cards are schemes, such as Child of the Elder Blood. And that has an effect that triggers at 9 source cards in the discard pile, which means you're kind of wasting one of those effect slots on a source card that could trigger past 7 with an effect that you really want to get, but there's only 13, so you're using one of the above 7 ones on a scheme, which couldn't be canceled at all. I hope that makes sense, but what I'm saying is when you're thinking about the good effects in your deck that aren't going to be canceled, there really aren't too many of them that you're actually going to be getting. You do have some source recursion, or I should say recursion through source cards with the Lady of Space and Time. You can kind of get into some late game battle hardened loops, especially when it can't get canceled with the 8 source trigger. You can just keep cycling ladies back and forth. That does draw you cards, so that isn't necessarily as good in fatigue as a battle hardened loop might be. But I will say most of these effects are very powerful, especially some of the early ones that trigger at 5 source. The 1 through 4 effects are like pretty standard and pretty mild, but once you get past 5, I think that's where the real money is. And the whole balance with this character is how do you actually progress while maintaining value from your cards? Because obviously that first source card you play isn't going to do anything because you don't have any source cards in your discard pile already. And depending on what you draw, the second source might not do anything either. So there's this whole toss-up of like, if you're just playing like blank cards early in the game, is that enough if you're getting some super powered cards later in the game? So overall, Ciri has a solid source card package here. Just note, all of these cards are 2 or 3 value. So the effect is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for these cards, meaning you're going to have to rely on your other cards in your deck for more like value-based blocking and or attacking earlier in the game, although these late game effects should carry you to a victory if you get that far. And just kind of mapping out these specific source activations, because this helped me to visualize like when each card was going to be useful in the game state. Lion Cub triggers earliest at 1 source in the discard pile, becoming a 4 on attack, which is all right. Then push to the brink at 2 source cards. Ziriel and the Lady of Space and Time each at 3, and then Child of the Elder Blood at 4. And it kind of, there's almost like a pattern where Lion Cub triggers first, and then it goes all the way through Child of the Elder Blood, 1 through 4. And then it kind of repeats again where Lion Cub then triggers at 5 pretty early. And then Push to the Brink, Ziriel, and Lady of Space and Time are all kind of in the middle, although albeit in a slightly different order. And then Child of the Elder Blood triggers again at the end of the pattern at 9. I hope seeing the 2 rows at the screen kind of makes it easier to visualize, but there is sort of like an optimal pattern you would like to draw some of your source cards in. If you get like both Childs really early, they're probably just going to have to go in the discard pile to pump up some other source cards earlier. And just depending on when you draw which cards in which matchup can kind of swing things, because there definitely are some matchup specific cards that you would like to see either really early or really late, and drawing them at the inopportune time might mean you have to sacrifice them to bump up some of the other cards, which can kind of mess up your game plan. The first non-source card I want to talk about is Channel the Source, which is actually a really great way to jumpstart the game plan of getting some of those source effects up and running early in the game. It has a very similar effect to Forever Hide, where you can discard any number of source cards from your hand, and you add +2 to the value of the channel of the source card for each source you discarded. Now, it is important to point out this card's base value is a 2, whereas Forever Hide is a 5. So you're starting at a much lower threshold, and you kind of have to discard a lot more cards for this to be a big, scary attack. At 2 source cards discarded, this is a 6, and that's when it starts getting a little bit worthwhile, I think, in the attack department. Although I think if your opponent throws down a good value block and you don't really have enough source cards to deal a decent amount of damage over it, I think you're fine just not discarding anything and kind of using this as a bait attack. It is good to note that later in the game, this card cannot be canceled. So if you actually have a ton of source cards in your hand, you could throw out like an uncancelable 10 or 12 even, and that might actually be worth like ending the game, although that would be basically all of the source cards remaining after you reach that 7 source threshold. So I think you're probably just going to use it more as a bait late in the game, just to kind of throw it out and make them waste like a good value block on. Although early game, if you are able to maybe discard 2 source cards and get off the ground immediately, that could be helpful. Although your opponent is probably going to play their cancels early in the game because late game they won't have as much utility, and this will probably hit more feints in that stage of the game, which might slow you down a little bit, but they might not draw them. And in matchups without cancels, this I think is going to be a really good card early in the game. There is a little bit of a trade-off though, because for every source card you discard, that is one card that you're not really getting a ton of value out of. So hopefully ramping up the source number for your activations quicker than you otherwise would have kind of makes up for the fact that you are getting less value out of that card, if that makes sense. Talking about the pair of schemes in Ciri's deck, we have Child of the Elderblood, which is the aforementioned source scheme. This card seems pretty insane when you read some of the source effects. At 4 source in the discard pile, you deal 1 damage to each other fighter in Ciri's zone, which is going to be really good for dealing with those pesky sidekicks. Ciri has a lot of big scary attacks that she would rather put into the enemy hero, so being able to take... Oh! There she goes. Everyone take a sip of water. Hydrate, homies. She has a number of bigger attacks that she would rather put into the hero than waste time on token sidekicks. So being able to clear a lot of them out, or at least threaten to clear a lot of them out, will make positioning on your opponent's part a little bit harder. And at 9 source, dealing 3 damage to each other fighter in Ciri's zone, I think is going to be amazing in 2v2. But also just having a 3 damage scheme in your back pocket to close out games is incredible, especially with the recursion that you can do with Lady of Space and Time. Unicorn Ally, I think, is my favorite card in this deck because it allows Ciri to play more of like a blitz tempo playstyle. I think her, or at least one of her biggest weaknesses, is actually card draw, because she doesn't have really any of it besides on this card and on the late stage Lady of Space and Time. But Unicorn Ally says Ciri recovers 2 health, and then it has the ongoing effect of after each combat your fighter is in, which includes Iharaquax, and it includes attacking or defending, and it includes combats in which you don't actually play a card. You get to draw a card, which means if you... Oh, and I should say the caveat there is that you have to discard that card at the end of your turn if you end with 5 or more cards in hand. So it kind of rewards you for playing at a lower hand count and aggressing, attacking a lot, and being able to draw off of the attacks. And if they attack you back, you draw back. It kind of reminds me a lot of Philippa's ability, which if you've watched my first impressions of her, I love her ability. And so being able to maintain your hand, even though you are attacking and defending a lot, will allow you to quickly put source cards into the discard pile and maintain pressure on your opponent, when otherwise I think Ciri has a little bit of a slower game plan that faster opponents can take advantage of. If we're moving on to the sidekick of the deck, Iharaquax has 2 signature cards. Bane of the Ain El, which is essentially a 4-value attack-only stallion charge that goes 4 spaces instead of 5 spaces. Really solid card. Again, another tool for Ciri to deal with pesky 1-health sidekicks that she would rather not soak some big source-powered attacks into. Being able to clear them all early in the game also makes the opponent's hero have to engage you a lot more, in which your other auto damage effects can really push the game closer to the end. As well as Searching Strike, which is a 3-value versatile that says after combat, if you won the combat, you may search your deck for a source card, reveal it, and add it to your hand. This effect is amazing in practice. When you're reading the card, you're like, oh, this is a tutor for one of 5 different cards in my deck that are usually pretty good, that when played will help me advance my source game plan. It's a little bit better than drawing a card, I think, in most scenarios. But the problem is, it is an if you won the combat dependent effect on a card with a value of 3, which kind of puts it in the same category as no contest expecteth, where your opponent is just not really going to let it trigger. You're probably going to have to block with this, because this is one of 2 cards that a Huara Quacks can block with, and your opponent is just not going to swing into them with anything less than a 4, because they don't want you to trigger this. They're not really going to bait attack your sidekick, because they don't want to give you the opportunity to get value out of this. So in games where your opponent wants to and is actively looking to deny you of the value of this card, which I believe they should, you're just not really going to trigger it. I think you can catch them sleeping if they're not pressuring your sidekick by throwing this out as an attack. But again, that's probably going to be earlier in the game. There's going to be more cancels running around, because they know late in the game won't be able to use the cancels, and also Huara Quacks' cards can always be canceled. They're not protected from your ability. So I just see this card as a bigger threat than a tool in practice. And to round out the deck, looking at the other cards that Ciri has at her disposal, we have Blink, which is a very solid skirmish-ish effect. 4-value versatile after combat, guaranteed movement. Moves Ciri up to 3 spaces. She may move through opposing fighters. This is a super solid card, especially for a move to melee hero. And it can break pins, can set up attacks, move through sidekick walls. Just really solid card. Probably going to be using this on defense more often than not. And we have Parry, which is a 3-value defense only any block that has immediately cancel all effects on your opponent's card. This is essentially, it's just your imagination from Bigfoot's deck. Having 3 copies of this is amazing, and this is one of the 2 cards that Huara Quacks can block with. This and Searching Strike, which means your opponent is probably not going to put many effect-based attacks with low values into Huara Quacks, because they're either going to get canceled or they're going to lose the combat to Searching Strike, and they would not want that. This means you're probably going to have to use Parry to block for Huara Quacks, because getting value out of the Bane of Ain-El is going to be super valuable in sidekick matchups, or matchups where your opponent has a sidekick. And so you're probably going to have to use your cancels a little bit earlier than you would like, which might be problematic in some matchups, but I think your sidekick not dying immediately is pretty good. Although something I should mention is that both of your sidekick cards have boost values of at least 3, which means they are not super dead draws later in the game if Huara Quacks is dead, because you can make Ciri a move 5 or move 6 fighter for a maneuver instead of just having a useless sidekick card in your hand. If we are going to book a flight to my favorite hypothetical unmatched fighter destination, it's time to go to Magical Optimal Fantasy Land and see what Ciri can do. I think one of the strongest early game combos she can pull off to really set up her sources for kind of like a mid to late game push are Channel the Source early in the game, maybe discarding your whole hand and getting a bunch of sources in the discard pile immediately, and then following that up with a unicorn ally to recoup the lost cards and quickly grow back your hand and just keep pressuring your opponent as your effects get better and better. Unicorn ally is a great way to kind of negate the downside of the discard from Channel the Source. Another magical optimal fantasy land sequence I want to talk about is kind of the super greedy late game finisher idea of playing Child of the Elderblood as many times as you can. Once you hit 9 source cards in your discard pile, ideally with other source cards that are not Child of the Elderblood or the Lady of Space and Time, which would be exactly the other 9 cards, since you have 13 cards and you have 2 copies of each of these for 4 copies. So 13 minus 4 is going to be 9. If you can get every other card in your discard pile, or maybe 1 copy of maybe 1 or both of these cards, you can play Child of the Elderblood at 9, go to 10 source cards, then play Lady of Space and Time, return a card from your discard pile to your hand. Let's return Child of the Elderblood. Lady would also let you draw a card at that source effect, and that way you can just spam the deal 3 damage to each other fighter in Ciri zone. If you are able to play both copies of Elderblood at 9 source, that's 6 damage. If you're able to play even a third copy, that would be 9 damage, which at that point in the game should be enough to close it out. And again, that is super greedy, but the scheme damage being uninteractable is incredible for opponents without hand disruption. Although Lady of Space and Time is going to be a low value block if you are using it that way, so you're probably just going to have to use it as an attack, which is fine since at that point in the game it can't be canceled. But that is a very strong idea for how to close out the game, although I'm not sure how reliable it is to get there in practice, as again, this is very dependent on draw order. So I mentioned earlier that Ciri is a big question mark for me in terms of viability, and if you couldn't tell throughout this video, I do like what I'm seeing here. I just think some problems have to do with how reliable and how consistent the source game plans you can make are. I have consistency down as both a strength and a weakness, just because your deck, I believe, is only 11 cards, with all of your cards being either 2 or 3 copies. You do have 3 copies of a lot of very good cards. So it is consistent from like a deck construction makeup, but I think the inconsistency comes from the source cards and the deck ordering that can really screw up your plans if you come into a game with a plan of how to execute and ideally how to order your source cards. Ciri has tons of effect damage, which is going to be really good. Oh, there goes the phone lady. Everyone take a little sip of water. Let's hydrate, homies. And Ciri's late game effects are going to be really good. I also really like Unicorn Ally as a way to kind of give you a little bit more of an edge in terms of tempo for a mid-game push. And I think in terms of weaknesses, the move 2 double melee is definitely a downside. And the sluggish start you can have, perhaps without a Channel the Source card early in the game to get you going, can really kind of cause you to sputter out earlier than you'd like in some games. And the lack of sidekick blocks, I think, is also something that enemies can target if they sense that you don't have anything to block with for your unicorn early in the game. It can get taken out early. 7 health, while being a decent amount, is probably enough to get like 2 tapped by most characters in the game. And so if you let that happen, then you lose a lot of value out of the sidekick cards. The Bane of Ain-El is also just a really solid card in general, so not being able to play 1 or 2 copies of that really hurts. And while Horrorquax isn't like the most crucial sidekick, losing out on him early in the game is not great. I think overall this character comes down to is the versatility in what you can do with all of your source effects and the strength that maybe the the unicorn ally tempo play or the super greedy child and lady finisher has, does that possibility overcome the fact that you are ultimately decently inconsistent due to deck order and mostly draw dependent in the earlier portion of the game? I think that is the big question that I am always faced with when playing Ciri. There are certain games where you feel unbeatable, and there are certain games where you just feel like your first 4 turns were just not productive at all. And I think most games will end up being somewhere in the middle, but just there are such extremes that I don't know if this character is going to be able to be reliable in competitive play. I will say on the bright side, Ciri does seem really decent into Arid. There's the phone lady. She does seem really decent into Aridin. Let's hydrate, homies. So I definitely think there is some potential into maybe multi-sidekick characters on the top tier. So I would like to test this character into Yananga, Electra, and Medusa pretty extensively. Although I think she just might be able to smack some characters that have really, really slow tempo games and perhaps would play even slower than her. Let me know what your thoughts are on this character. This is probably the one I will have my eye on the most because she does seem fairly strong and decently fun to play. It's just a matter of how much are you willing to deal with potentially a bad shuffle ruining your day. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Again, please let me know what you think of this character in the comments down below. Hopefully you have been drinking water along with me as your phone lady has been waking up. If you put this on the TV or something and your phone's sitting next to you, please let me know how many times your phone lady woke up in the comments down below. I'm looking forward to getting the rest of these first impression videos out later in the next couple days. So stay tuned for that, as well as some other content coming out before the end of the year. Tier list. Alrighty. That's going to wrap it up for this video today. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, like, subscribe, and yay!